The issue of mercenaries in Iraq first came to our attention in 2004. Now, with U.S. troops pulling out, are more mercenaries going to be going in? We'll talk about that next on Global Perspectives.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida.
Hello and welcome to Global Perspectives. Perhaps no word sums up the controversy of the Iraq War more than Blackwater. Originally conceived as a training and consulting firm in 1997, by 2010 it was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in sales. In 2007, the corporation reached new heights of notoriety as its employees were accused of killing 17 Iraqi civilians. Despite a series of name changes, controversy continues to follow what some call America's mercenary army. Jeremy Scahill questions the appropriateness and methods of private security firms. Author of the best-selling book Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, and winner of a George Polk Book Award, Scahill is also a contributor to the weekly news magazine, The Nation. Thus, he is ideally suited to answer this question: are Blackwater and organizations like it necessary evils of our time, or do they represent a dangerous blurring between state and corporate entities? Welcome to the show, Mr. Scahill.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us how you got started with the Blackwater issue.
I started going to Iraq in 1997 and spent a tremendous amount of time in that country. And I remember watching on March 31st, 2004, as four Americans, were ambushed and killed in the Iraqi city of Fallujah, and their bodies were dragged through the streets and strung up from a bridge along the Euphrates River. And it was sort of an iconic moment of the war, one of the days that the war turned when the Iraqi insurgency started. And when the initial reporting on the deaths of those four guys happened, it was portrayed as civilian aid workers that were killed, or four civilians butchered. But in fact, what we learned quite quickly was that they were four men who worked for a very secretive private security company called Blackwater. And I had spent a lot of time in Fallujah, and of course what happened was that the U.S. retaliated, and George Bush, who at the time was president, ordered a siege against the city of Fallujah in revenge for the killing of these four Blackwater men. So I started investigating the company then. But when it really became clear to me that it was sort of a microcosm of everything that was happening in the U.S. at the time and around the world was when I was in New Orleans covering Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And I'll never forget it. I was standing with two New York City police officers in the French Quarter. And it was the anniversary of 9/11 was coming up, and we were chatting about what they were going to do. And this car pulls up next to us. And these four huge men get out of it. It was like a sort of, special ops clown car or something. It was like an endless string of these gigantic men getting out of it. And they came up to the police officers and they said, "Where are the rest of the Blackwater guys?" And my head sort of started spinning, and the cops told them something, and the guys got back into their car and they drove away. And I said to the police officers, "Blackwater, you mean like the guys in Iraq and Afghanistan?" And they said, "Yeah, they're all over the place." I said, "Really?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to talk to them. Where can I go?" And they said, "We can go either way on this street," implying that they were everywhere. And sure enough, I went and I found these Blackwater guys. Some of them were former Navy SEALs or 82nd Airborne. They're carrying M4 assault rifles on the streets of a U.S. city, Glock 9s strapped to their legs. And I talked to them, and long story short is they told me that they were there to confront criminals and stop looters, and that they were there under the auspices of the owner of their company. When I started asking them, well, are you working for the Department of Homeland Security? Are you working for the National Guard? They were sort of saying, well, we're not going to talk about that. So I did an investigation, and it turns out that the Department of Homeland Security hired Blackwater on a no-bid contract to provide security for FEMA. Now, FEMA wasn't down there at that point. I don't know if FEMA's arrived yet, but Blackwater was there guarding them, and they also were working for private businesses. So to me, it was sort of, we saw sort of Baghdad on the Bayou, where you had a lot of these companies, Bechtel, Halliburton, Blackwater, that were in Iraq, now were operating on U.S. soil. And I think for a lot of Americans, and for Congress, because Congress did investigate this, the idea that you have these private security companies that apparently are not subjected to any effective oversight whatsoever, carrying weapons on the streets of a U.S. city and talking about confronting criminals and stopping looters, raised a lot of constitutional questions and other questions about civil liberties. So I really started to investigate the company after that 1-2 punch of the Fallujah ambush and then New Orleans.
So you talk about a blurring of the line between corporate and state entities, and then the question, why were they there? Why were they needed? Why wasn't that a job that regular authorities could handle?
You know, one of the real tragedies of what happened in New Orleans and elsewhere in the Gulf was that the Louisiana National Guard was deployed to Iraq, and the forces that you normally would want responding to that kind of a disaster just frankly weren't there. And so the Bush administration hired a lot of private companies to come in, and they got paid a tremendous amount of money. But I remember when the Louisiana National Guard guardsmen came back, I was there in Louisiana, how angry they were when they got off their plane. And they said, this is just a disgrace that we were over there in Iraq instead of being here in our home state when a response was really needed. So you could look at it, the most benign way of looking at it is that the Bush administration saw that there was a need and filled it with the private sector. The cynical, though I would say more accurate view of it, I think, is that it was an opportunity for a lot of these businesses to cash in on the misery and destruction of the Gulf. And they didn't necessarily provide good services, but they made a lot of money.
And this also underscores the extending reach of these types of organizations. Give us a sense of how far that reach goes globally.
I mean, people have to understand that the wars that we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan were the most radically privatized wars in U.S. history. You know, when U.S. tanks rolled into Baghdad in March of 2000, in April of 2003, they brought with them the largest army of private contractors ever deployed in a war zone. So you very quickly had a reality on the ground in Iraq and later in Afghanistan where for every soldier that you had on the ground, you had a private contractor. So in other words, you know, we had 140, 150,000 U.S. troops and then an equal or greater number of private contractors. Some of them were armed individuals like those that work for Blackwater. Some of them were doing laundry, and they were women from Nepal working for KBR or Halliburton. But the point here is that the nation state throughout history, one of the ways that there's been some semblance of global stability is that nation states have had a monopoly over the use of organized violence. Uniformed militaries, invasions of other countries, treaties, international bodies, international norms and regulations. What happened over the past decade of these wars is that several private companies built up a capacity that is the equivalent military capacity of a small nation state's military. And so what you have now is a reality where the use of organized violence, special operations capabilities, highly specialized intelligence capabilities are on the open market for bidding. And so in the case of a U.S. company that's built of former CIA people, former special operations people, former FBI people, those people have a wealth of knowledge and access to intelligence and contacts that should be very closely guarded by the United States. By putting that on the open market, it means that China, for instance, could potentially hire an American company made up of former intelligence and special ops people and use them to their benefit and ultimately, potentially to the detriment of U.S. national security. So I think there's a lot of concern in the intelligence community over the U.S. losing its monopoly even over its own people. And so you have a situation where in Iraq, at the height of the fighting there in the, let's say, the mid-2010 decade, you had 300 to 600 private companies at any given time that were operating in Iraq. You had 180 private security companies operating in Iraq. That's almost as many nations as there are registered at the UN. And whenever the U.S. does something, embraces a trend like this radical privatization or drone warfare, well, China and Russia say we're going to do that too, and they try to justify it at the UN by saying, well, America's doing it as well. So I think we've treaded into very dangerous waters with what we've done over the past 10 years. We've turned the whole world into a recruiting ground for these private companies. So nation-state militaries are sort of becoming a thing of the past as asymmetric warfare, non-uniformed actors on the world stage. Some of them are terrorist groups, and some of them are private security companies, are all operating on this global battlefield now.
Private militaries, mercenaries, if you will, have been part of the scene for the longest. And is this an appropriate role in the 21st century, or do you think they should not be engaged at all?
The U.S. actually has more of a tradition of fighting against mercenaries. If you go back and look at U.S. history and fighting against the Hessians, for instance, Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, likes to call the park, Lafayette Park, across the street from the White House, Contractors Park. And he talks about von Steuben and Lafayette and Kosciuszko and other foreigners that had come to the United States to participate and help the U.S. in its various war efforts. But if you put everything on the table, the U.S. has generally been against the use of mercenaries. What I think is the challenge here, and the answer to it is going to be in your political outlook. If you supported President Bush's foreign policy, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you almost necessarily had to support the use of these private companies because the United States military was stretched incredibly thin. They had deployed a record number of people classified as diplomats into these war zones that necessitated private security. And if you wanted to keep those wars going, you had to either support a draft, which was very unpopular politically, or you had to start using private security companies that could recruit from around the globe, not just within the borders of your own country. If you were against those wars, that just is one argument you can make, is to say that we shouldn't be using mercenaries, we shouldn't be having forces that are not held to the same standards as U.S. soldiers are. These guys weren't subjected to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. There were all sorts of loopholes that allowed them to escape prosecution in civilian courts in the U.S. But I think at the end of the day that we decay the fabric of our democratic republic by hiring companies that commit acts in the name of the American people and are not held to account. And to me, the biggest damage that we did to our own nation in using these private forces was to allow them to kill with seeming impunity and immunity around the world. And that sent a very bad message. It also, I think, disgraces or creates a shameful contrast between the treatment of private contractors and soldiers. These private contractors make hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you look at how so many military families in the United States are suffering. Unemployment rates are skyrocketing. So you force the military into a competition with the private sector to keep its best soldiers. Talk to people at Special Operations Command, and they'll tell you they have to put non-compete clauses into the contracts of some soldiers to keep them from jumping over to the private sector. So it ultimately, at the end of the day, degrades also the U.S. military capability by enticing soldiers to leave and go over to the private sector. I think you can make a full spectrum argument against it, and I think you're going to win that argument.
So would you be on the side of getting rid of these altogether or subjecting them to stringent controls?
Well, I don't think that there should ever be an outsourcing of the use of violence by the United States of America. Especially not to forces that are not held to any effective accountability, either by Congress or by the judicial branch of the United States. I think it's a very slippery slope that a nation goes down when it starts hiring, hired guns and mercenaries, which is what this turns into. I do think that there is a role within the U.S. intelligence community for private sector actors, and I think that if they're responsible companies, the knowledge that they can bring to the national security structure of the United States is fantastic. But all of these companies have to be very highly regulated, because if you have access to highly classified intelligence and you're working on that for the United States government, but you're a private company, and you also work for foreign governments or other corporations, then you have potential conflicts of interest where the United States government's interests become secondary to a higher paying customer. And so that would be my main concern with using them for intelligence. But I do not believe that we should be outsourcing any use of violence to private sector actors. The record is clear the past 10 years. They just haven't been held to account. They've done far more damage to the United States than they have good.
When we look at the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and the fact that they're winding down, it would seem as U.S. troops come out that you would see proportionate reduction in other influences, but you found that the opposite is true, that the private forces are actually increasing as the official U.S. forces are drawn down.
Right. The boring part of this answer is that some of the military contractors that were servicing the troops in Iraq, for instance, doing the laundry, driving trucks, peeling potatoes, those contractors are leaving with the soldiers that they were supporting. But where we're seeing an increase in contractors is with the armed contractors, because Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, when the drawdown in Iraq was implemented, put in a request for 7,000 more private security contractors to guard this massive embassy that we have in Baghdad. The size of our embassy in Baghdad is the size of Vatican City. It's like 8 football fields. The Vatican has embassies around the world, and we have an embassy the size of Vatican City. The biggest CIA station in the world. Thousands of people classified as diplomats, and now an army of private contractors. So you are seeing a surge in private contractors there. And in Afghanistan, we've long outsourced significant portions of that war to private companies like Blackwater, Triple Canopy, DynCorp, Armor Group. And there have been scandals involving a lot of these companies, and there have been civilians killed, and there's been very little accountability for it. So I think the Obama administration came into office saying that they wanted to reverse a lot of the Bush-era policies. But if you actually look beyond the rhetoric, there's not a lot that has fundamentally changed from the Bush administration to the Obama administration when it comes to the issue of private contractors, except a lot of lip service paid to accountability.
So this issue isn't going to be resolved anytime soon.
No, and I think it's a trend that we should watch grow around the world. A lot of other countries saw what the U.S. did in Iraq and Afghanistan and said, well, we want to get in on that business. So it's we've set a ball in motion and opened a Pandora's box. I'm not sure we're going to be able to close anytime soon.
Yeah, what happens when private militaries from competing countries clash?
Well, there's some of that has taken place on the ground in Libya. It could potentially happen in Syria. The governments of Qatar and the United Arab Emirates are serving sort of as surrogates for the United States, and there's a lot of private security companies from the U.S. that have relocated to the Emirates or to Qatar. In fact, Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, now lives in Abu Dhabi and has been caught up in a scandal involving another private security company there. There's this term that I think a lot of Americans should become familiar with called proxy warfare. And what we're seeing now is Iran, the United States, Russia, China, we're all engaged in proxy warfare around the world, meaning that our militaries are not necessarily fighting one another, but various private actor forces or surrogates for our government are fighting each other. And it could quickly develop into a more overt hot conflict if we're not careful. The Horn of Africa and North Africa are really the front lines now of a big proxy war involving the US, China, Russia, and Iran. And a lot of national security experts are paying very close attention to what's happening there, and part of it has its origins in this outsourcing of the nation-state monopoly on the use of organized violence. It's a throwback to sort of the era of supporting the Contras in Central America, where it's not that the U.S. is invading a country, but it's sending money and sending weapons. We're seeing that play out again in some parts of the Middle East and North Africa and East Africa.
You've been visiting other trouble spots well beyond Iraq and Afghanistan. Tell us about some of those.
I just came back from Yemen, which has been identified by the U.S. Counterterrorism community as the single greatest external terrorist threat facing the United States. There's an offshoot of Al-Qaeda called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula that's been operating there. And I was traveling throughout Yemen, and particularly in a province in the south of Yemen called Abiyan, which is where Al-Qaeda is very, very popular. And one of the things that's happened is that President Obama really intensified the drone bombing campaign in Yemen. Bush had largely left Yemen alone. Obama's been doing a lot of airstrikes there, authorizing Tomahawk cruise missile strikes, drone strikes. He authorized the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, this American-born radical cleric, in September of 2011. And what I found on the ground is that this targeted killing campaign is actually not so targeted, and a tremendous number of civilians have been killed, along with some of the people that the U.S. actually wants dead. And so we're engaged in this sort of war of attrition, where we think there's a finite number of bad guys, that term they always use, bad guys, and that if we kill them, then we can deplete the leadership and then we'll wipe out the organization. Well, we're engaged in an operation that's inspiring blowback. And what I found in Yemen is that the anger over the civilians being killed, and the idea that the U.S. is potentially turning Yemen into another Afghanistan, which is exactly what Al-Qaeda wants the U.S. to do, is actually breeding support for Islamist militancy. And so I would just encourage people to pay a lot of attention to what's happening in Yemen and to ask serious questions about the unintended consequences of some of our military action outside of these battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. The other place I was recently was in Somalia, where there's another group called Al-Shabaab, which recently pledged its allegiance to Al-Qaeda. And in Somalia, most Americans only know Black Hawk Down, from when the Army Rangers were killed and dragged through the streets of Mogadishu in the early 90s, prompting Clinton to pull the U.S. troops out of there. In Somalia, once again, that country is just a den of chaos. It's probably the most lawless place on planet Earth. And what I found there is that the U.S. once again is given money to warlords. I traveled with some of them to go and hunt the bad guys. And what's happening is a lot of innocent people are being killed. They're angering a lot of local people. And so our actions that are intended to stamp out these terrorist groups are actually inspiring new generations of people to join in these struggles. So the theme of a lot of the reporting I've been doing is about blowback and how our actions now are going to come back around to hit us someday if we're not careful. And I think there are some people in Washington that understand that, but these aren't issues that sell in people's districts, so you rarely hear members of Congress talk about them.
Mm-hmm. So what would you recommend instead as far as activities that could be designed to counter terrorism and other problems?
I think President Obama came to office with a lot of goodwill around the world. I think people throughout the Muslim world were really hoping to hear a different direction announced for the United States. And I think some of that has happened. Certainly rhetorically it has. I would just caution the United States from getting involved with any more military action in that region. I think we've reached a point of diminishing returns, and we're reaching a point where we're inviting another spectacular terrorist attack like 9/11. I think we need to disengage militarily and engage on a humanitarian level, and also realize that in a lot of these countries, the form of governance that is most likely to lead to stability is going to be an Islamic government. And so we need to stop being afraid of the word Islam and start realizing that some of America's best natural allies in these countries would actually be Islamist movements that are not jihadist in nature and are not interested in establishing the caliphate, but are interested in being left alone and doing no harm to others. And I think we've made a big mistake by criminalizing Islam, because I think that you have to respect what's indigenously right to people, while at the same time standing for your own principles. But the key to it, I think, at the beginning is to make a good faith posturing that we're not going to be bombing in these countries anymore, and we're going to try to engage in with a different path.
And do you think that will create an environment in which the people in these countries will rise up against these problems they face?
Look at what's happened throughout I was just in Egypt recently also, and the brave young people in all these countries are the ones on the front lines of it. And a lot of them do want democracy, and some of them want Islamist government. And I think at the end of the day, we have to let them decide what kind of government they want. But many of the people that were brought down were in one form or another backed by the United States. And so I think we have to take a humility pill as we watch the events play out in the Middle East, and realize that we're at a spit in the ocean of history right now. And for a lot of people that are out in the streets, they see history through a much wider lens than we do. And so, Mubarak being overthrown in Egypt, was an epic event for the people of that country. But we also have to realize that we're continuing to support a military dictatorship there after Mubarak. And if we don't shift our direction in some of these countries, we're going to end up on the wrong side of history in those countries. Bahrain is a dictatorship supported by the United States. Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen was supported for years and years by the United States. We were on the wrong side of a lot of these equations. And so, I do think that we have to be humble, stop seeing ourselves as the cops of the world, and monitor the various movements that are fighting for change in these countries, and engage those that we think represent a version of our values, and try to encourage them rather than inflaming the most radical elements of these societies by fulfilling their prophecies and bombing their countries.
Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Scahill. And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.